nice. And I love it. New York. What can I learn now? Thank you, Hansel. I am doing that commute. That was one of my only requirements. Like my anything else I can kind of think of. Yeah, so they're in my party. And we had to get tested. So yeah, but I was just that was like almost my only requirement.
Yeah, that's cool. That makes it easy. I actually spent 10 minutes down the road. We have the office, you know, right near my house. But it's like, you can do that when you found your company, right?
Yeah, it's something else.
Yeah, then you've got.
All right, hello everybody. Good afternoon. I hope you all are having an incredible time here for the reunion. It's so exciting to see the building bustling like this. My name is Hansel Kang. I'm Executive Director, Assistant Dean and Executive Director of the Broad Center at Yale School of Management. And I'm so pleased that you all chose to spend this next hour with me. So we're a small group, obviously, so please jump in with questions at any point. I have just a few slides I'll run through, and then we'll save at least half the time for questions and answers, but please feel free to jump in at any point. So I'll just start with a little bit of background about myself. I have been at SOM for just about a year and a half now, and I came to SOM after spending my career working in K-12 public education. So my first job out of college was teaching high school social studies on the Navajo Nation, and then I held some different roles at Teach for America, worked as the Chief of Staff at the Tennessee Department of Education, and most recently was the State Superintendent in DC before coming to SOM. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about this question of why having great public schools matter. And so I will share a little bit with you all about how I think about this and the work of the Broad Center and how we are trying to tackle how we can get to great public schools for all students. And then we'd love to just have some discussion and dialogue. Okay. Jump in. So just wanted to share some context, and I know there's some people in here who are deeply expert in this subject as well, so please feel free to chime in too, but I wanted to start with some sort of basic foundational context around this topic. So when you look at a national assessment called the NAEP exam, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, it shows that we were making real gains in student outcomes throughout the 2000s, but those gains have since stagnated. So this is an assessment that's given every 2 years in 4th and 8th grade reading and math. It's taken across all states and the District of Columbia, and so it gives a real apples-to-apples picture, both longitudinally and across the country, of student outcomes. And so all the data I'm showing here is from 4th grade math, just for consistency, and this is all pre-pandemic data, so none of this is affected by the pandemic yet. Yeah?
What's the maximum score?
That's a great question that I should know, and I don't actually. I want to say it's like 600, so the scale goes quite high. This is an average scale score right now.
So basically I'm just trying to understand, is the peak of this good or not good?
I would say the peak is not great, not where it needs to be.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. But while it was not great, it was improving over time in the 2000s. And then since the 2000s, though, or since 2009, you can see that the results have really stagnated over the last 10 years or so. The other piece of really troubling news is, as you can imagine, that average scale score across all students masks a lot of gaps that exist between different student groups. Those gaps exist along lines of race, income, language status, disability status, but they also exist when you look at the trajectory of students at different percentiles. So this is now looking at the performance of students at different percentiles from the 10th up through the 90th percentile. And you can see from 2003 to 2009, all groups were increasing, slowly, but all groups were increasing. But since 2009, what you actually see is that the top performing groups have continued to improve, while the lowest percentiles of students have unfortunately stagnated or even started to decrease a little bit. So the gap between the lowest and the highest percentile is actually wider than it used to be. And I should say in all of this, I'm talking about student performance as sort of a shorthand, but obviously this is about how we as school systems, as adults, are supporting students in learning. This is not about their potential. This is about what we are doing as grown-ups in the education system to support their learning. So we are not doing as good of a job at helping our lowest performing students improve as we are at helping our top students get better. That said, the average scores nationally also mask some real differences in trajectories in states over time. So I just picked Massachusetts here as an example, in part because they're neighboring, in part because for many years they were actually both the fastest growing and then the highest performing state in the nation. So you can see they were already well above the national average in 2000, continued to improve quite steeply for a number of years. And Massachusetts really implemented a series of reforms in the 1990s that then propelled its outcomes for the next 20 years or so. But then since 2009, you'll see actually Massachusetts has dipped quite a bit and is actually on the decline relative to where it used to be. In contrast, these are the results for DC, and so you can see DC started out as the lowest performing of any state in the country and was struggling quite deeply in 2000, was improving but still well below the national average in 2009. Since 2009, unlike the rest of the country, has actually continued to improve at a really rapid trajectory, and as of 2019 was within earshot of the national average, which was quite remarkable. And the other difference in DC is, unlike the national average, you can see that the growth in outcomes was pretty consistent across different percentiles. So the lowest performing students were improving in addition to the top performing students. That said, even though that might sound really good and there's a lot of progress to celebrate in DC, there are enormous gaps along lines of race ethnicity that persist. And DC has made more progress in closing gaps than any other state, and yet the gap is enormous, as you can see. So the blue line up top is the performance of white students in DC. The red line down below is the performance of black students in DC. And so the circles in the middle are showing the gap. So you can see in 2003, that gap was 60 scale score points, so enormous. By 2019, it was 47 scale score points, so had narrowed, and again, had narrowed more so than the gap between black and white students almost anywhere else in the country, but still is obviously enormous.
Is it possible to summarize some of the top reasons why that gap was narrowed so much?
Let me try. So I think there was a lot happening in DC all at once, so I think it's hard to disentangle sort of what was causal, right? Because a lot was happening all together. Same with Massachusetts, really. There were a lot of things happening together over those 20 years. But a few of the things, and I should also preface this by saying, I will try to be unbiased in what I'm presenting, but I think different people would argue it was different things. I think in DC there were a number of things. There was an enormous investment in schools, so it has some of the highest per pupil funding in the country and has continued to increase that funding at rapid rates. There's been a real investment in early childhood, including universal pre-K starting in 2008. So free universal full day pre-K across DC for all 3 and 4-year-olds. There was a real investment in human capital, so teacher salaries are significantly higher than they used to be, and there was a robust teacher evaluation system put in place that also began to differentiate compensation based on performance. There was an adoption of high standards in terms of content standards and rigorous assessments there. So those are a few of the things that people would say. I should also acknowledge that DC has gentrified quite rapidly, as have many other cities, so there definitely has been some change in the student population as well. However, there has been research done showing that the change in student population comes nowhere near explaining the level of growth that has happened in DC. It could only explain a fraction of what has happened. There's been real improvement.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question for business and society. So I wanted to just take a minute to talk about this because you might be wondering what is SOM doing working in public education, and you might think of the Broad Center as really being tied to the and society part, and I think it is certainly. So this quote here from the former U.S. Secretary of Education, John King, I think sort of exemplifies what that and society part could look like. So he says, "I was fortunate that I had teachers and mentors who kept my life on the right path after I lost my parents." He lost both his parents, I think, before the age of 12. And these young men involved with the criminal justice system didn't have those mentors and teachers at the right moment. But now they do have folks who are intervening in their lives. Seeing that was a reminder of the urgency of our work. Schools and educational opportunities can save lives. So that's sort of the and society argument. But there is also, I would argue that this matters critically for business as well. So even our MBA students who are going into the private sector and have no interest in public school systems, I would say education matters deeply for them to think about as well. So this is a quote from former Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam, who, this is from his 2016 State of the State address, where he said, "This is our opportunity. Let's bear down on what we can do together, keeping Tennessee as a state with a strong financial condition, helping Tennessee to be the #1 location in the Southeast for high-quality jobs, and making certain that all Tennesseans, regardless of their circumstances, have an opportunity for high-quality education." Governor Haslam, when I worked in his administration, always talked about his top priorities being economic development and public education, and he saw those as integrally entwined. Every business that he talked to about relocating to Tennessee or growing their operations in Tennessee would immediately ask about the status of the schools and whether they were going to be able to find the workforce they needed for the jobs that they were creating. So these things are inextricably linked. So I think hopefully this shows you all that differences in outcomes are possible, but not to be taken for granted. We are not on an easy glide path, but it is possible to improve outcomes. It matters for both business and society that we find a way to do so. And my next argument would be that management and leadership matter in that work to make that difference in outcomes happen. So when we think of public schools, we tend to think of course, students, classroom teachers, and school principals. But actually, our school systems are very large and complex organizations, and there's a whole infrastructure behind that principal, teacher, and students that is not always visible to us. So this is just a sample sort of stylized organizational chart for a district. So there are teachers and school principals, but you can see there's a whole level of other infrastructure that is what we tend to call the central office of a school system. So you need a chief academic officer, a chief of data, a CFO, a COO, a chief talent officer, and so on. And there are many different kinds of then supporting roles in the teams that they lead. And just to give you a sense of this in real terms, so Chicago Public Schools is one of the largest systems in the country, has a total operating budget of nearly $7 billion and 39,000 staff, 642 school sites. So you can see, when you think about sort of what it takes to lead this work, that is an enormous leadership role and an enormous management and leadership challenge all throughout the organization. As part of when I first came into my role, I did a series of listening and learning conversations with a number of Broad alumni, SOM alumni, and other partners who do this work, trying to understand what their perspectives were and how we could build the Broad Center's work to maximize sort of the opportunity we had here. And there were some really interesting quotes from SOM alumni who work in K-12 public education about how they were able to draw from their MBA educations in this work. And again, I think bolstering why management and leadership matter so much. So, this top quote, when I think about my experience at SOM through the lens of what I'm doing now, I wouldn't have been able to do this work without it, working in a school system. The second one, Anjani Jain was in here before, doing the session just before me. A couple of people, actually, more than one person. This was the most frequently cited course or like specific program element was modeling managerial decision making as a skill set to bring to school systems to be able to forecast the impact of decisions, not just look retrospectively on them. And then I think people always love this last quote, so I include it. But a lot to learn about how to work within bureaucracies and in complex organizations more generally, and even better than a school leadership specific program. So the opportunity that is in front of us, so I mentioned that in my role here, I lead this organization, or the center within SOM called the Broad Center. So you all may have seen that the Broad Center was established in 2020 through the generosity of a gift from the Broad Foundation. And it is a center focused on these questions of how we can support school systems in improving the outcomes that they are able to create for K-12 students, families, and communities. And so we at the Broad Center, what we do is we foster the ideas, policies, and leadership to help K-12 students in urban school systems in particular, especially those from historically underserved communities, to learn and thrive. We do that through 3 pillars. Our first pillar is leadership development. So we operate 2 concrete leadership development programs to help accelerate leadership trajectories and impact. Then we have a pillar around research to generate knowledge about effective school systems, and then policy engagement to inform and elevate policy debates in K-12 education. And we're bolstered and enriched by the work of the Broad Network, which is a nationwide community of nearly 900 alumni of TBC programs, a couple of whom are here in this room. The Broad Center, actually, you may be wondering how we can have so many alumni when we are a brand new center. The Broad Center used to operate outside of SOM as an independent center headquartered in Los Angeles, had 2 leadership development programs that existed for about 20 years called the Broad Academy and the Broad Residency. I'm an alum of the Broad Residency myself. And then there was a decision made to sort of wind down the operations of that independent center and launch the Broad Center here at SOM. So we are really lucky to be able to continue to engage with and support these nearly 900 leaders across the country, many of whom continue to work in K-12 education.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I didn't do it. I had a question. I remember when reading about the Broad Center, and there was some criticism when it came, and I can't remember exactly, but this is Eli Broad, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering if you could tell me what it was, because I couldn't remember.
Sure. It could have been a couple of things. I will say public education is an incredibly political arena. There's very little that happens in public education that is not without controversy. Some of you may have heard recently about there is quite the fight raging about the best ways in which to teach reading, which sounds very innocuous, but it's incredibly tense, actually, those debates around the country. So anyway, I think some of the criticism that that often emerged around the Broad Center's work was that, Mr. Eli Broad was a billionaire, and he created this center and endowed the center at SOM through a very generous gift. Some people feel that education is too often swayed by the influence of philanthropists who have quite a bit of wealth. So you all may have heard about Mark Zuckerberg, who invested, I think, $500 million in Newark schools at one point, and there was a feeling that one individual giving that much money can sort of have a particular influence. So that's just about, I think, philanthropy generally. I think the other thing is the Broad Center has been criticized over time for, it's been perceived sometimes as supporting charter schools over traditional public schools. I would actually say, in my experience, the Broad Center has always been quite focused on supporting both sectors, and sometimes gets supported by more adamant charter supporters for continuing to support traditional district schools as well. So we at the Broad Center continue to support leaders in both charter networks and traditional school districts, as well as state education agencies. And sorry, at least the last one I would say is there was, I think, the Broad Foundation used to do quite a bit of grant making in public education, as well as operating the leadership development programs. And I think sometimes criticisms about the grant making, again, along with the philanthropy argument, sometimes got conflated with the leadership development programs in a way that wasn't always accurate, but sort of got sort of tied together. Certainly. So our focus really in the early launch period of the Broad Center's work has been around standing up these two signature leadership development programs. So the Fellowship for Public Education Leadership, which we call the Broad Fellowship for short, and the Masters in Public Education Management, or the Broad Masters program. So the fellowship is a 10-month executive leadership development program for superintendents and senior level executive leaders who are looking to strengthen the public school systems in the communities they serve. And then the master's program is a 14-month cohort program for emerging education leaders. And both programs, thanks to the generosity of the gift, are offered tuition free, so at no cost to the students and the fellows involved. So we, just to go back to the school systems and give a picture of this again, so there's the teacher and the principal part that we looked at before. This top layer of folks is the sort of Broad Fellowship candidates. So superintendents, the people sitting in the #1 seat, and the cabinet level leaders just below them. And then when you think about the Broad Masters program, it is more the emerging leaders at the sort of mid-level of the organization. And the goal is to both when you talk about the Broad Masters, the goal is to both support the master's students in increasing their impact in their current roles. So having a really effective director of data and strategy or manager of family outreach can make a huge difference in the work in their current roles, but it's also meant to help accelerate their leadership trajectories, so support them as they might step into those chief level roles or superintendent roles in the future and help ensure that they feel prepared to do that work as thoughtfully and strategically as possible. So the Fellowship for Public Education Leadership, or the Broad Fellowship, launched last year. We had an inaugural cohort of leaders come through the program, sitting in classrooms just like this one. I don't think we were in this one, but we were in the one next door at some point. The fellowship includes these 4 themes around leading self-teams and organizations and so on. And it's a mix of faculty-led sessions, practitioner talks, and cohort reflection and connection. So the fellows came to campus for COVID aside, hopefully they will be coming to campus for 4 one-week sessions throughout the year in person. We were a mix of in-person and virtual last year. And the second cohort of Broad Fellows is actually coming tomorrow to start their work. So we are super excited about being able to support them. They had an incredible experience. We weren't quite sure what to expect. This is a new program at SOM. We were, building on an incredible legacy, but really trying to think about what it would mean to do this work here at the School of Management. And our first cohort had a truly incredible experience. Rosanna Musetti, who was a superintendent in Napa Valley Unified, was a superintendent prior to coming into the program, was already a really experienced and thoughtful leader. But she talked about how the program experience really leveled her up as a systems leader in a way that was actually observable to the people in her community and her organization, and the way in which she was able to also be reminded about the importance of authenticity and vulnerability. In the program, we really balance both the content of the work and that leveling up in the skill set and tools and frameworks our fellows have, but also that level of connection and tapping into your own personal leadership and the strength across the cohort, because these roles can be really tough and lonely at times. And then the Broad Masters program is actually about to launch in just 3 weeks for the first time. So this is a Master's in Management Studies in Public Education Management. You may know that SOM in recent years has launched MMS programs in asset management and other areas. So this is a new track in the MMS program for public education management. Both programs are for people who continue to work full-time in their school systems. So the master's students, this is a non-residential program where they continue to work full-time and will come to campus periodically for 5 one-week intensive sessions, and as well as holding virtual sessions in all the months in between. And so through that in-person and virtual time, they'll engage in coursework, colloquia, and an independent study capstone project. And this just gives you a sense of what some of the coursework will look like. So across these 4 strands, both classes that will sound very familiar to you all, like managing groups and teams, or managerial decision-making, as well as some new customized courses like equity and access in public education, for example. And we worked really closely with a curriculum committee of senior faculty members to develop this curriculum over the past year, along with seeking practitioner and Broad alumni input on it as well. So I'll just close with this quote from Kerwin Charles, the dean of the school, and the potential he sees for the Broad Center to have a transformative impact on public school systems, to help ensure that the students, the young people in our systems, get the high quality and effective education that society owes them. We think we can help to do that through the Broad Center's work, and ensuring that the school systems have the best possible leadership and management that is thinking carefully about the tensions that exist, the challenges that exist, and how we can bend the curves of those different outcome lines you all saw at the beginning of the presentation. So with that, I will open it up for discussion and questions.
How is the Broad Center thinking about its measuring its impact?
Yeah, this is a great question and a very tricky one in public education. This is, where do I start? So that national assessment that I showed you all, again, is given every 2 years and is the only sort of assessment like its kind that is given consistently across states. Other assessments differ state by state, so it becomes very hard to compare results. But because it's only given every 2 years, only in 4th and 8th grade reading and math, and the results only come out at the state level, there are real limits to what it can measure in terms of granularity. So it couldn't measure the impact of a superintendent, for example, because it is too high level in its results. Assessment data in general can be tricky because if the superintendent starts and the results come out the year later, is that really the result of that superintendent or the work of the predecessor, right? And superintendents tend to turn over in this field every 3 to 5 years, depending on what study you look at. So there's quite frequent turnover. So there's a lot of constraints. That said, I think we are looking at a few things. So certainly we look at the feedback of our program participants and whether they found it to be valuable. And our first Broad Fellows cohort really did. 100% of them strongly agreed that the program was valuable and that they would recommend it to a friend or colleague in the future. We will also look at things like alumni survey data. So the Broad Alumni Network has been taking an annual survey every year for I don't know how long. We have a long tradition of heckling people until they complete the survey. So really strong participation rates in it. We gave the first one from SOM last fall. And then starting this summer, we're actually going to start to look at measures of network connectedness and network engagement. So sort of what are the levels of connectedness that exist within the network itself? And how can that, ultimately, we would love to see how that can help support outcomes. Can it support longevity? Can it support other sort of outcomes over time? And then that survey also gives us some data around, for example, career progression that we hope could serve as the basis of the research pillar in the future. So for example, looking at does being part of our program assist you in your future career trajectory? Does it help reduce gaps between leaders of color and white leaders or leaders who come from different backgrounds? Things like that. So those are some hypothetical areas that we could look at, but it's a question that we're still grappling with, and frankly, it's an overall question that I think the K-12 education sector as a whole really grapples with based on what's available.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk about how big your cohort is and the level of interest that you see?
Yeah, absolutely.
I do see people leaving the profession, and I'm just curious.
Yeah, there's a lot of turnover happening right now, in particular, even more so than is typical. In our fellows program, the more senior executive education program, is a cohort of 20 people a year. Our first cohort was about 16 people. The new cohort that is starting tomorrow is 23 people, but about 20 people a year. And then the master's program is about 30 people a year. So our first cohort is exactly 30 right now, actually. For the master's program, we actually had 240 applications this year for the ultimate selection of 30 people. So it was about a 13% selectivity rate. We were really pleased to see that level of interest, given that it was a brand new program and something we were, frankly, we're defining the final requirements for a couple of weeks before the application opened. So there wasn't a lot of lead time for people. And it's a big time commitment, although it sounds truncated to be on campus for 5 weeks. These are people in very busy roles in their systems, and so to be away and completely offline from those roles for 5 full weeks out of a year is a big deal. And so both they and their systems, their employing organizations, really had to be committed to giving them the time and space to do this work. And I think, knock on wood, I think they really are. We've tried to help them really think through what the implications are.
I think on one of your diagrams, you were showing the management system of the school, and you had a classroom teacher, and then maybe it was a superintendent or supervisor or something. My question is, when I came out of college many, many years ago, I attended a program here at Yale called the Master of Arts in Teaching program. So the thrust of the program was to help teachers or prepare teachers. I don't know if the university has anything like that now. Is the assumption that if the management structure is good enough, what is the assumption about preparing teachers?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. My understanding is right now the university does not have a sort of teacher preparation program. I think it's gone through various iterations over time, but right now there is not one. There is a program at Yale College called the Education Studies Program, but is not leading to certification in the same way. What I would say is actually that it's not, certainly teachers are absolutely essential. Teachers are essential in this work, and the heart of what happens in public education really is the interaction between teachers and students in the classroom. The reason that we focus on management and leadership is that, a great teacher can make great things happen on their own, but it is much more likely that you can have more great teachers who are willing to stay in their roles if you have a strong principal who is supporting them, right? So creating the conditions that enable that interaction to happen. And then beyond that, if there is an infrastructure around the school system that is helping facilitate the best possible conditions for their work. So you think about, one of my examples was like the budget director or like the director of literacy. So an amazing teacher could go out on their own, figure out the best possible ways to help their students learn how to read and how to support every single child in their room. But if you have a school system with a great director of literacy, instead of that teacher having to go out on their own, it would be built into their professional development schedule, right? Rather than them having to invest the time and outside of what's built in. And the budget director may be thinking about how do we really shift around the resources to make sure that teachers get the professional development they need, and that we purchase the right kinds of curriculum that will support them, rather than teachers having to pay for it out of pocket. So basically, a great teacher can find a way to make things happen on their own, but it is much more likely that they will feel supported, be able to stay in their work, and that there will be many more great teachers if the conditions around them are supportive for them.
I'm not sure I quite agree with that, but I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and thank you very much. It just seems to me if you have a young, spirited person coming out of college who wants to teach, I'm not sure it's enough to have a good management structure, because I don't think teaching is that easy. In other words, I don't think that people without experience in teaching can just drop themselves into a good management structure and all of a sudden they're a great classroom teacher.
I agree, actually. I didn't mean to imply that. What I meant was, I think you are much more likely. So if you zoom out and you think about, let's say there's school system A that has poor management, and school system B that has great management, and all other things are equal. You are going to find more great teachers able to survive and thrive in school system B than in A. Yeah. And in the education field, there are a lot of programs to support teachers and to support principals. There are some to also support superintendents. There's actually almost none to support the Broadmaster's level, those other levels within the school system. So you again think about something like Chicago Public Schools, that's nearly $7 billion operating budget, and these different functions that are so critical for a school system to operate effectively, and not having people in those roles who can perform at the highest level, and the amount of drag and burden that creates for schools when there aren't great people in those roles. Oh gosh. I'm going to start with you in the back, and then I'll...
Okay, sorry, go ahead. You mentioned purchasing curricula, and that leads me to think of where the innovation is happening, and there's a huge amount of industry that's third-party oriented, whether it's curriculum or technology. And so I'm just curious as to, in the org chart, there's no innovation team, and who's driving the bus on that?
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, that org chart was very much, it was a stylized sample. Many districts do have a sort of chief innovation officer role, and what the definition of innovation is, though, I think differs a lot from school system to school system. I think, to your point, I guess I would offer my own perspective on this is there is really important work. There's a lot of work that happens in, as you said, curriculum, like textbook materials and other curriculum materials, as well as education technology. What I've seen is that the programs that try to actually the prior discussion, it takes a great teacher to make the best use of those tools. And without a great teacher, those tools cannot sort of compensate. Speaking with a really broad brush. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but generally I think that is one of the challenges with education technology or with sort of very individualized learning programs, that it can take a really great teacher to make that all happen. I think to your broader question about sort of where innovation happens, I think this is a really good question, and I think it can happen at sort of different levels. It can happen at the level of like what materials you use. It can happen at the level of what a teacher's schedule looks like and how much time they spend in collaboration with their colleagues versus working directly with students. It can happen in what school models look like. But I think, there's a lot of discussion in K-12 education about how the fundamentals of our structures look very similar to what they did a century ago, and sort of asking ourselves the question of how do we innovate more. This is actually something the master's students are going to do during their first week. Is they're taking a class with Nathan Novemsky. It's part 1 of managerial decision making, and it's around problem framing and how to make the best possible decisions. But he's building in a unit specifically around how you think about risk and innovation, which is a really tricky topic in K-12 education because you're talking about working with students, and students only have 1 4th grade year, so it can feel really scary to say, I'm going to take this giant risk with something, and yet we know that what we're doing now is not working for all students in the way it needs to. So I think it's an area that we need to explore further, I guess. Let me come here. I'll try and keep my answers shorter, and maybe I'll take these 3 questions, and then I'll come to this side of it.
Yeah, so mine's a little bit less of a question. I want to sort of echo something that you raised. So I am not an SOM grad. I am the spouse of an SOM grad, though I do have an MBA from Columbia. And I used to be the Deputy Chancellor for Operations at the Department of Education in New York City. I never met any of my counterparts in any other school system. I don't know who they are. I had 1 phone conversation with Chicago, actually. 1. There is no, at that level, there is no forum. There is no support group. And I can't imagine the same thing in a lot of other industries. And so that's an interesting, I think it's potentially a very interesting exploration area for the Broad Center. I think, my hat was infrastructure to allow teachers to be successful, to allow schools to be successful. But the big philosophical questions around education or the fight seem to be around, should schools be a more structured, consistent product? Or, as literally was stated once by our head of teaching and learning, is every single individual school a unique experiment? And I think, that's another area from a research perspective that I'd be very curious about if anybody is dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think you're getting at, there's obviously a lot of research that happens in K-12 education, but the vast majority of it is at a classroom or the school level. It's looking at teacher and principal actions or sort of other questions. There's very little research actually done around governance structures or, to your point about the level of sort of centralization versus autonomy given to individual school sites. There's a little bit, but not a ton. And I think there are really interesting and rich areas to dig into with our research pillar when it's up and running.
Just building off of that, your answer just now, what is SOM's or the center's priorities for thought leadership? Because that was one of the circles that you showed earlier.
Yeah. So in research and in policy engagement, there's a couple of things I would say. So one is part of the gift that was made that established the Broad Center was actually to endow a senior level faculty position. It actually called for 2 faculty positions, one of which is being held. We're using one for a visiting program, and so Bill Height is joining us as superintendent in residence this upcoming year. He's just completed 10 years as superintendent of the School District of Philadelphia, and is coming in to help facilitate our programs. We will use that visiting slot in the future for postdocs in residence or policymakers in residence, sort of other voices to be a part of our work. And then the other position is for a senior tenured faculty member who will really direct our research and help figure out sort of what that overall direction and vision is. So some of that I think is still TBD. My hope is, though, that as I was sort of hinting at, that I hope we can delve into some of these questions about organizational effectiveness for school systems in a way that doesn't really exist in the field. And it does exist in other sectors like healthcare, where we know that there's a difference between sort of the medical research for patient outcomes and also the organizational research about healthcare systems. For whatever reason, that hasn't really happened in public education in the same way. So my hope is that, one, we are able to do that kind of research and then think about sort of how can we then engage with people around sort of what it would look like to create those systems.
So from the standpoint of sort of experimentation and innovation in schools, my question is specifically around how does that differ between the charter system and the public school system? I realize that's a question not from an educational professional standpoint, but from a parental standpoint. I'm curious on your perspective on that and how you see that affecting the quality of outcomes.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, charter schools were in part started to be labs of innovation, right, by being freed from some of the restrictions that traditional public schools were held by. So, for example, most charter schools don't have to follow the same teacher certification rules and may look for other ways to cultivate high quality teaching that are not necessarily defined by a state certification process, but could be defined in other ways. I'm trying to think of another example. Most charter schools are not unionized, and so they can think about their teachers' time in different ways that are not bound by a collective bargaining agreement. So some pay teachers more to have school for a half day on Saturdays or to extend the length of the school day in some way. So I think charter schools have been sort of places of innovation in that way. I would say, though, that my experience, so in DC, actually half of our students are enrolled in traditional public schools and half in public charter schools. And so I visited a lot of schools of both types, and I saw traditional public schools that were trying big and exciting things, and I saw charter schools that looked quite traditional. So I think it is not defined by those sector lines, and much more so by sort of how you think about what you are trying to innovate on within your realm.
So just one quick follow-on question to that. The structure that you shared there, and you can tell me it varies too much school to answer in general, but is there the same sort of superstructure, or do they tend to be kind of, charter system by charter system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do think it depends. So in DC, KIPP DC was the largest charter network in DC. So it had 17 campuses, 5,000 students, and it does have a central office structure that looks, not dissimilar from a district office structure in many ways. But there were many other charter schools in DC that are one school, that are sort of a one school organization. So did not have nearly as much of the sort of infrastructure. That said, there are small districts. In Tennessee, we had a district that was 300 students, single school. So it also had very few people in that central office. So I think it is more about sort of size of the system than, again, the lines. Yes, please.
Can you zoom out even further and talk about what your ideal would be for school boards and parent constituencies to produce the most effective outcomes in schools? Because I see the political landscape now as being a little fraught regarding curriculum and control.
Yeah, understatement, I think. It's a really tough political moment for school systems and for all the constituents you talked about. I don't know that I have a great answer. I will say I think it's been interesting because there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of, I think, justified and well needed push in K-12 education over the last however long to increase parent voice and family voice in schools, to make sure that there's strong two-way communication and that parent voice and buy-in is present in really thinking through big decisions for a school system rather than sort of being an afterthought at the end. And yet, I think what I heard our fellows struggle with was, as leaders who really embraced that and tried to invite that, now feeling really challenged by the ways in which individual parents are coming to board meetings and engaging that in a way that doesn't feel intended to be part of a robust discussion, and instead feels like it is sort of meant to be destructive or to shut things down. And so I think that is a real challenge that leaders are facing. I think one thing I've seen is that on the parent engagement side, a lot of the concerns that have been raised are often the vocal concerns of a very small minority. And so there's a way in which system leaders can still, and I think are really trying to figure out how to engage a broader group of families in a discussion about that is rooted in reality, rooted in community concerns, that tries to listen to what those concerns are, but not be, totally defined by a very small minority. I think boards, this is a whole nother tough discussion. And it sort of gets to the governance structure question too. I'll just say, I think there's a reason why one of our 4 weeks in the fellowship is devoted to navigation. And what we mean is things like understanding your political environment, understanding how to work with your board, and how to work effectively together. But I think we've seen, there's actually a Broad alum who has worked with a number of school boards, and her name is Monica Rosen, and there was a news article about her work I don't know, a year ago maybe, where she was working with a small school district that had hired her to help lead a superintendent search. And she basically got the board to admit that they needed to pause the search because there was so much division among them, and until they got on the same page as a board, they weren't going to be able to hire a leader, which I think is true actually of a lot of boards, but the fact that she got them to admit that and to do it in a news story was sort of remarkable. So I think there's more work to be done around sort of how to help boards also be effective, and there are some organizations that try to do that, but to really think about how do you help a school board member think about what their role is, what is the appropriate role that they can play, an important role that they can play in the system, and how to really ensure that boards and leaders are working in partnership with one another. Sorry, you've been waiting for so long.
So you're kind of in the first inning here, but I'm curious about so far, to what degree do you use existing courses with little or no modification to populate the programs? To what degree do you have to create something completely new, and is there a kind of a modification middle ground there? How did you build these programs, and where do you expect that to go in the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the fellowship was a little bit different. It's a program that we do in partnership. The Broad Center delivers in partnership with the executive education team. And so we really benefited from the SOM executive education team having a really strong sense of, when we have worked with leaders across all these different sectors, this module has been really effective. So let's bring in, this person to teach this module. And I think we've largely seen that those are, that our fellows have really embraced and appreciated and gotten so much out of learning from case studies from other sectors, almost even more so than in examples from K-12 education. I think because, they were sharing with me that they go to conferences, they get to talk about the K-12 education examples all the time, but the examples from other sectors are very new for them. And also, I think it helps pull them out of their day-to-day. Your head doesn't immediately go to here's how my situation is different, or here are all the constraints. You can instead just think about sort of what this new framework is in a different context, and then think about sort of how it applies in your own setting. So I'll give an example. Last year, David Bach, who was deputy dean here for many years, came back from Switzerland to teach a couple of modules around shaping the political environment. So he used this framework that he's used in the MBA curriculum for many years, and talked the fellows through a case around Formula One racing, of all things, right? So something very different from K-12 ed. And then in the second part, he actually used an education-specific example. There was a lengthy New York Times Magazine article about a superintendent in rural Mississippi, I think, who was trying to get a bond measure passed, and who was sort of applying that framework then to, his constituents, his situation in Mississippi, and then getting to talk through the application. So I think that was a mix of sort of like an existing thing and then tailored in the application. There's been other modules where it's really been just straight what the person has taught before, and it's been hugely successful. In the master's program, it's sort of a mix. We tried to think about what does SOM currently offer that feels applicable in this realm, and the answer is a lot. And then also having a lot of conversations with the fellows and other practitioners to test those assumptions, and then to also, frankly, be realistic about how much we can tailor and customize in this first year versus what we might build out over time. So we've started to develop a couple of K-12 specific cases, like actual written cases, with the case team here, and I think we will have many more of those over time as well.
Do you hope or expect that you'll be creating more customized courses, so separate from individual cases?
Yeah, I mean, so to some extent we've had to customize because the structure of the master's program is so different from a traditional degree program. So even like managing groups and teams, which is a traditional course, is being delivered in a very different way in this program. So there has been just some innovation through the structure of it. And I think one of the things I'm excited about, though, is maybe less so the structural innovations, but more the sort of case development or other sort of curricular developments, and how it can sort of also help inform the other degree programs and even the MBA curriculum at SOM.
Love that. So it's like, especially for this master's program, so what kind of qualifications or like the background that you're looking for? And then also for, I live in this suburb, the Seattle area. It's like superintendent is, as you said, it's like every 3 to 5 years. But, there's executive directors are same, old, and they're like former principals and sits there for. So it's like even for those, superintendent came, and first year they tried to understand the system, and then second year they tried to do for like a strategic planning or something, and the third year they made like a criticism or something and they go. So it's like I'm trying to understand this master's program is trying to raise those leaders from inside, not just those former principals and those people sit there.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, for our master's program, the qualifications were that you needed to be in a central office role, so not in a school-based role, and that you needed to have the minimum qualifications were at least 5 years of work experience and basically be a supervisor of some kind. Those were the minimum qualifications, but we actually see quite a range in our incoming cohort. We have some people who've been in education for 15, 20 years, and some people who have come up through that very traditional route, who've been teachers, then principals, and then gone to the central office, and other people who've sort of come from different areas. I think the theory really is a couple of things. So one is to help people, as you said, from within the system also have the skill sets to engage and think more strategically than maybe they've had the opportunity to, or to bring sort of a different set of knowledge than they've been able to in the past. The previous Broad program, that was the legacy program that the master's is drawing some inspiration for, actually had a different model. It mostly recruited people from outside K-12 education into the field for the first time. So often people with MBAs or with other graduate degrees who'd had experience in and had real functional skill sets that too often were missing in school systems, and sort of recruited them in, gave them a crash course in K-12 education, and then sort of it helped them make an impact within their roles. The master's program is, I think about it as addressing the same underlying need, that there is a need for management and leadership all the way through an organization, not just at the top. But rather than sort of bringing people in from outside of the system, taking people who've come up through the system and giving them the skill sets and some exposure to these ideas as well. And part of how I do think about it is, I think there are times when there are internal candidates for a role who have a lot to offer, but an external candidate may be seen as bringing something else, right? And so how do you help the internal candidate also have that something else in some way? I think the other thing is, to your point about sort of how even even if there's a lot of turnover at the number one seat level, there can be greater stability within the organization. I think part of this is not just waiting for that one superstar leader to come along, but rather to try and build up the impact and the potential of, I think about it almost as like seeding the field in a way, so that like even if that number one great leader is not there, that someone can be making a real difference within their academic shop and then someday become the chief academic officer and be really leading some incredible work from that realm. I also think about, when we were recruiting for the role, I was asking people who work with school systems all the time, think about that HR director you've run into who is not just the traditional like pushing paper or just compliance focused person, and think about what a difference that makes when you run into that person versus the really traditional function. I want that person, the one that like they're not a superstar, they're not in the headlines, but they are doing something different in that role. We want to elevate them, we want to elevate their leadership. So those kinds of people. Other questions? Reactions, pushes. Jeremy, Sarah, anything you want to add?
I'm Sarah, and I'm a SOM grad of 97, and then a graduate of the Legacy Broad program. And I think, Hassel, you've done such a beautiful job in translating it to this environment. But I think in my work in education, I've benefited so much from that SOM toolbox, if you will, and applying that to public education. And for me, my Broad experience was really coming from the private sector, giving me that K-12 educational experience to be able to leverage both my SOM toolkit and the educational understanding of the educational landscape so that I could be an effective leader of a public school system. So, Jeremy, I don't know what you...
I'm an O2 grad, Jeremy Chimetta, and I did both Legacy Broad programs. I did the residency in 2004, and then I did the academy a few years later. And I'm just really thrilled that the program's living on, and that it has this permanent home. And I think my Broad residency experience, I felt like was the very best of SOM, lived in a cohort of 20 people. Right? That was my experience. And for that to live on here is great. And I think the urgency of this work right now is greater than it's been in my career. I do believe K-12 education, especially urban education, is facing an existential crisis more than ever.
And something you said about that, you wish you had that cohort. Like, that was my Broad network. For somebody coming to education after the private sector was, I was a chief of staff, which as we all know is you're handling a lot of different things, from advocacy to parents to filling in when somebody leaves, and to be able to turn to my Broad network and say, I need a crash course in family engagement, like who can help me out? That was invaluable to me.
So I went into public education following a 20-year private sector career. I actually started in a fairly mid-level position at Department of Education in New York, and just kind of, I had a very different skill set. It was very clear that I had a very different skill set, and it's part of what enabled me to do ultimately what I did. And I simply was in the right chair at the right moment, and that's how I got to my position. It was actually when I was hiring a chief of staff, and I was interviewing a candidate who was a Broad Fellow. And she asked me, who's your network? Who is your cohort? And it was at that moment that I realized I didn't have one. I hired her.
That's great. Yeah, I think just to build on those things really quickly, I've seen our fellows do so much to push each other's thinking, to support each other's learning, as well as supporting each other personally and professionally. And I think it's because they've talked about how it's even more intense. They do have networks of support, but it's more intensive because they have this foundation of common learning, and then we build in a really intentional time together.
Building on what Sarah said about having this network of fellows that you can turn to. What is the center now that it's here doing to foster that fellowship across classes too, not just in one year group because it's only 30 people, but how are you going to build that into the program?
Yeah, it's such a great question. The alumni network has always been a key part of the Broad experience and is really important to us to continue forward. Myself and my deputy are both alums of the Broad residency, and so we feel we have benefited from the support of the network in our own careers and feel really strongly about trying to carry that forward. And we have to be really honest that we actually have a pretty different staffing model than the team in Los Angeles did. The team in Los Angeles had a very high-touch, personalized approach to alumni support that was wonderful, but isn't going to be replicable for us. And frankly, that the team there also talked about the network was just getting so large that they were not going to be able to operate in the same way either. So we're thinking about a few things. So one is just the ways in which we continue to convene and bring people together. So there's sort of a signature annual gathering that the Broad Network has held called the Forum. We unfortunately had to hold it virtually both last year and this year, but it's the most engaged Zoom I've ever been on. Last year when we did it in January 2020, we had, I think, 400 people log on throughout the day, an incredibly active chat, and a keynote panel that was sort of by Marian Wright Edelman and her successor at the Children's Defense Fund, talking about sort of the legacy of sustained leadership, and then also, so it meant to sort of inspire, help people feel reconnected and so on. And we're planning right now for our 2023 forum to be in person, so stay tuned for that. So convenings like that, but also other types of groups too. So there are affinity groups along lines of race and LGBTQ group that continue to meet actively, and we're supporting the leaders in that. We held a series of regional gatherings this past spring, had 150 people come together in 10 or 12 cities to again reconnect. And then there's sort of the functional support